Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, welcome to today's Black History Month lecture. Clap yourselves for being here. Are we all excited? Come on, we can clap a little better than that. Come on, clap yourselves. So I am honored to serve as your moderator for this important discussion centered around the theme Kiss Teeth, Head Tie, and Cornrows, Black Girls and Women's Cultural Dominance in the Digital Age. My name is Brittany Forsyth, and I'll be your moderator for this evening's proceedings. So we're gonna have a good time this evening. We're gonna have a good lecture, an insightful one, and a one that's gonna raise awareness. And we're gonna have good discussions even after the lecture is finished tonight. So, throughout history, black women have been at the forefront of cultural innovation, resilience, and resistance. From the days of slavery to the present era of the digital age, black women have continuously shaped and influenced society, culture, and technology in profound ways. So, without further ado, we're going to embark on this enlightening journey of exploration, understanding, and appreciation for the cultural dominance of black girls and women in the digital age. So, we have a phenomenal presenter here this evening to share with us, and her name is Dr. Keisha McPherson. Can we put our hands together for her? So I'm going to read a short profile on Dr. McPherson. Dr. Keisha McPherson is an educator and scholar with over 15 years of research and teaching experience in critical race, cultural studies, social justice, education, and media. She holds a PhD in education from York University in Toronto, Canada. Her research and scholarship are focused on the impact of media, education policies, and contemporary representation of blackness on the identity, education, and development of black youth. Dr. McPherson uses cultural theories and black feminist approaches to examine contemporary popular and digital culture. In 2006, Dr. McPherson started her career in academia as an assistant lecturer at Carimac at the University of the West Indies, Mona, and is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Professional Communications at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. So her presentation this evening is titled Kiss Teeth, Head Tie, and Cornrows, Black Girls and Women's Cultural Dominance in the Digital Age. And I'm already excited to hear, all that she will have to present on this topic. So her presentation outlines some of the often co-opted and appropriated cultural practices and contributions of black women and girls within an online digital context. Using an analysis of techniques that can be described as discursive tools of online critique, she examines and critically interprets how some pervasive contemporary cultural representations are circulated to maintain oppressive social constructions of identities and reinforce status quos. The goal of this black feminist social media analysis and cultural critique is to validate experiences of black women and girls as their cultural traditions and physical aesthetics remain open for manipulation and mass consumption. Two, she hopes to contribute to emerging scholarship that showcases and recognizes black girls as dominant cultural producers, particularly within online spaces, and engage in ongoing shifting discourses surrounding the prevalence and impact of cultural appropriation of black women and girls within the contemporary popular domain. And I think this is a fitting discussion, seeing that we're in February. It's all about Black history. And I want us to sit back and really listen and engage in what the presenter is about to say to us. At the end of her presentation, we're going to be having questions and answers and just a fulsome discussion. So please be as attentive as possible and put your hands together for Dr. Keisha McPherson.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that introduction, Brittany. I lost the, you have the, so thank you again for having me. So Jamaica, and by extension the University of West Indies, means a lot to me. I'm not born in Jamaica, but I often reject any acknowledgement of my national identity being anything but Jamaican. I do think that I've earned it. Not only am I a citizen, but through birth of my parents, one of them who passed recently from Gimimabit, Clarendon, and the other, my mother, from Negril, Westmoreland, I've always been blessed with opportunities to live, grow, and learn and teach here in Jamaica at various points of my life. And as noted by Brittany, my academic career started at Karamak and Mona, and after the completion of my master's degree. So I'll forever be grateful for the beginnings, or for those beginnings, to help shape and to continue to inform my direction as a scholar. So thank you again to Dr. Prendergast for the invitation and for the ability for me to participate in this series. I have a lot of things to say on this topic, so we could get started. So I come to this work from several different points of academic study. So I do consider myself to be a cultural studies theorist and sort of engaging with media, but then also looking at it from the intersection of education, as well as cultural studies and critical race theory. And so what I do is I use a Black feminist epistemologies, or several Black feminist epistemologies, to analyze and to discuss and to sort of position what takes place within digital spaces, especially as it relates to Black people, Black girls, and Black women specifically. And so what this work, in terms of my investigation and sort of looking at and analyzing digital online spaces, what this work allows me to do is to sort of pinpoint, highlight, and really emphasize the importance of the cultural production of Black women and the ways that it's taken up within a commercial capitalist sphere, and how that often erases the work and the experiences of Black women. And so we're here to talk about this. So the purpose and the aims of the work that I do is to really position and contribute to the framing of Black geographies across the diaspora. And so what we need to do now is to position the Black diaspora within online spaces as well, because there's a lot of Black cultural production that's taking place within social media and different online platforms. I also want to examine the representations and the co-opting of Black female aesthetics specifically from an intersectional perspective, and then build on Black studies scholarship to ensure that Black women are correctly being noted for and valued for the contribution and the work that they're doing within an online context and within digital media. And so that's really the purpose of this work and this ongoing research. So where the work begins. So some of the questions that come up, especially as it relates to Black culture, is who owns these representations, right? So if we're thinking about female aesthetics, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but if we're thinking about female aesthetics and representations, who's the owner of Black culture? How is Black cultural ownership taken up in the contemporary digital age? So considering things like capitalism, considering other forms of oppression beyond sexism, other terms that have been coined because of the need to have specific language to identify what is taking place socially in reference to the behavior and sort of the engagement of Black scholarship. How do we distinguish the difference between what can be considered cultural appreciation and what is cultural appropriation, and what that actually, what are the implications for Black people globally. So this is kind of where the work begins and where you start to sort of see some of the images and the text that are circulated within online spaces and the questions that come about. So I'm about to show a video here. I want to apologize for the profanity in the title, but this is just to sort of position how we will look at Black women and their contribution to critically analyzing some of these representations. You can play the video. Thank you.
We got a very cool video to show you today. And it has to do with very colorful hair, so we know that most of you will be interested to see. This process is called hair weaving, and it involves attaching additional strands of hair to the braiding to achieve the desired look.
What's she call it?
And this process may have become our latest obsession. This hairstylist is showing us so many amazing styles. Braiding the hair with colorful strands really takes it to the next level. They almost look like characters from a video game.
No, she didn't. No, she didn't. Why she say that?
If you ever thought about changing your hair color but didn't want to commit, you could give this a try since these kinds of braids last to 2 to 3 weeks.
If you got the, let me see.
Braiding the hair together with the colorful strands might seem like a complicated process, however, to this hairstylist, this process is a piece of cake.
Wait, is that yarn?
You can definitely get creative when it comes to the braiding as well. No need to stick to just one style.
Oh.
Even if you have short hair like so, you could still try this hairstyle. And this client has chosen to blend her hair with some pink strands. It's such a great combo.
Oh.
Let's step out of the box for a second and see what...
So this is to give you an example of some of the work that Black women are doing within these digital spaces when it comes to specific cultural representations, traditions, and just the ways of living. So looking at this particular video, she's critiquing this idea of hair weaving. So notice the name that is given to the process in the video as hair weaving, with this, and I'm sure many of you can look at this example and see the resemblance of things that your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother were doing with Black hair for centuries. But what is happening here is the co-opting and the taking over of these cultural processes that have not only been significant in the lives of Black women, but is also essential for survival. And so what we see here is this commenter here, and I couldn't get the actual handle of this particular person because it was posted by somebody else, but what she is doing is she's critiquing this style, you know, just with her insertions of outrage, let's say, in terms of what is taking place. And this is where the work begins, and when we start to see more examples of these types of cultural co-opting, this cultural appropriation, and this sort of taking over. So coming back to the question, who owns Black cultural representations? And I don't think that is really what I want to focus on in reference to ownership. I want to focus on what is erased when we do not recognize and emphasize where some of these cultural practices come from and why they were created in the first place. So it's the erasure of Black cultural production, Black female cultural production, that is at question here. So the argument here is that Eurocentric narratives surrounding notions of femininity, as well as white-centered beauty ideals, continue to represent the status quo within popular culture. So even though we see these examples of Black female aesthetics being circulated and very popular within digital spaces, the idea of what is beautiful, what is feminine, still is centered around whiteness. And it might seem confusing because the prevalence and the popularity of Black aesthetics on non-Black bodies, and sometimes is termed as blackfishing. So you can see some of the examples in the images here of non-Black women that are taking up Black aesthetics. So the first example is a sort of duetted picture of a white woman that when she sort of, I don't know, what would we say, like puts her costume on, she puts on a costume that resembles somebody who we might be described or sort of just look at as a black person. And then some of the other celebrities at the bottom there taking up black female aesthetics. So things like cornrows, lip fillers, curly, like tight curly locks that usually happens with Afro hair is then taken up by these different women who are non-black. So the question of co-opting and appropriating black culture comes in because the norm has led to commonly circulated visual texts that often malign the physical characteristics of black women, only then to normalize that appropriation and the black aesthetics on non-black people. So what happens is that black women are still critiqued, often disparaged for exercising or expressing these types of cultural traditions on themselves, but non-black women then get the space to be able to do that. So black women take up the labor of protecting their cultural traditions and the aesthetics within the online spaces. So similar to the other video, what you're seeing is a black woman actively protecting that culture, actively protecting that process. But then what tends to happen is that black women themselves within these spaces are criticized and questioned for their critique of these representations. And so a form of gaslighting takes place, where it's like, we don't have the right to speak about those things. We don't have the right to claim that these things are belonging to us. So this brings me to the conceptual frameworks that I'm working on. So I'm putting together all of these different ideas because there's a number of different theorists and frameworks from cultural studies into digital media that have been working on different areas, not necessarily within the digital space, but still thinking about how racism is experienced within our social world. So I came across this one particular theory of race lighting, which I thought was really interesting. And what race lighting is supposed to do is to explain the process in which it describes how black girls and the experience, and in terms of the interpretation of the content and the images that reflect notions of appropriation, which co-opt the aesthetics of black women. So it's this process that takes place that when those images and narratives are questioned, we're told that we don't have the right to feel that, or we're crazy, that doesn't belong to us, and therefore everybody can experience it, or everybody can then participate. So this concept of race lighting, I think, fits right in here. Now, it's an educational framework, but I think when we're putting it together with some digital frameworks, then we get a better understanding of what is actually taking place. So then, coming back to some really foundational cultural studies work, looking at the work of Stuart Hall and encoding and decoding, that describes the process of the black women and black girls who are actually interpreting and establishing meaning from the social productions that they are seeing happening and taking place online. So this is how black women and black girls also produce their own meaning through their own critique. And using discursive tools of resistance, which is through some of the technological tools that are available, they are able to then actively critique this co-opting and appropriation that tends to happen. There's black cyberfeminism, which was noted by Kishona Gray, which positions black women and girls' intersectional analysis in media and media representations within a broader theoretical perspective as it relates to the oppression that is carried out in online spaces. So what tend to happen, from a sociological perspective, is that we know that these experiences happen within our social world, face-to-face in our lives, and we need to find the theories and sort of explanations for us to better use language to describe what is taking place within digital spaces. So lastly, I'm thinking about, and this is something that is not fully fleshed out, and I'm sort of looking at who is actually talking about this, but I'm thinking a little bit about the digital labor of black women and girls, which reflects the role that black women play in the protection and the service of black cultural preservation and to ensure anti-exploitation online spaces. And so thinking about that labor, we then now have to focus on the labor that black women then take from the physical world into the online world in order to do this cultural preservation. So what does this look like? So I just wanted to sort of, highlight, when we think about digital spaces, we're talking about social media platforms. So this is anywhere that culture, text, discourses, or narratives, anything that we see online is debated and translated and shared. What comes to mind is this concept of Black Twitter, which is a funny thing because you had some people actually going online looking for Black Twitter, not recognizing that it was a space within the larger platform that was etched out for specific Black cultural conversations. And so this becomes part of that digital space. The next thing is the use of technological tools to actively analyze, critique, and resist narratives of and representations that subjugate Black aesthetics and identities online. And then this labor also takes up this form of policing, and I say policing just because of the use of the term, that insists that protecting the origin, the indigeneity, as well as the labor that surrounds Black women's cultural production and contribution inside and outside of digital spaces. So why is the labor of Black women distinct and nuanced in social and economic context within these spaces? Now, because it draws on what Bell Hooks talks about and sort of like supporting Hall's work on encoding and decoding, the process in which the oppositional gaze towards some of the manifestations of oppression that Black women have historically had to take on. So thinking about manifestations of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, for example, and how that exists within digital spaces. So when Hooks was describing this, we're talking about what it exists in physical spaces in our everyday interaction, but we now have to sort of begin to theorize what it means in digital spaces. Now, in Hooks's work, the theorizing of resistance struggle involving Black women engaging in media and disengaging from it. So this idea of the oppositional gaze is both engaging and disengaging from these representations. So they do that whether or not it's personal, political, and purposeful ways. This is to suggest that the burden of racism, sexism, misogynoir, and other forms of oppression create conflict and tension in the digital lives of Black women and girls. So the work is often carried out on their backs in terms of responding, critiquing, finding ways that they can then actively insert their critique within these digital spaces to ensure that their culture is not completely taken over and overrun. And so when I talk about this concept of discursive tools of critical resistance, I'm using the examples of the technology that's available on many of these digital platforms in order for people to actively converse. You know, when you think about digital media and social media spaces, we're looking at town halls. They sort of seem like, or they replicate some form of town hall. You have somebody that says something, and then you have like a call and then a response from the community. And so there are different ways in which, for example, TikTok allows its users to then engage with the material that is being circulated. So there's the green screen, which is the video technique that allows one to layer their image on top of the video or image. There's stitching, which is the video technique that allows the creator to put together multiple videos in order to make a point. And then there's duetting, which is probably my least favorite, which is a video technique that allows the creator to place two videos side by side. Now, the reason why that's my least favorite is because a lot of times when people duet videos, they don't really add to the context. They're just pointing at what's happening in the original video, which to me is not, useful sometimes. But it's still something that we as Black women and Black girls will use in order to actively critique some of the material that we see. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I've pulled from online spaces that is really demonstrating the labor that Black women and girls are putting into really sort of speaking back or clapping back at some of these representations. Now, some of the images or some of the commentary is a little bit hard to hear and understand because I've extracted it from online, but I'll try to do my best to translate it afterwards.
People steady in my comments talking about this bonnet, saying I don't need it, white boys don't need bonnets, just take it off. Continue. was it you said? I thought it was someone who can't put their hair behind their ear that said something.
Okay, I'm not gonna really talk about what he said because enough people have made videos about it and I'm not gonna add on to it, but it's really the black people in the comments for me acting like a bunch of pick-me's. For a white man in a bonnet, nonetheless? Like, I don't know about y'all, but just in my opinion, even if I found the video hilarious, I could have thought it was the funniest video I've seen in a minute, you would never catch my black ass kiki in the comments. And gaslighting other black people? No. And also, these two comments right here that he liked, I don't like that because a white man being fluent in AAVE, that don't even sound right. And I don't like how he's acting dead on how some people would see this as a microaggression. Because which community has often been called bald-headed or said that they can't grow hair, especially the women in it? Which community might have an issue with a white man wearing a bonnet and using AAVE? Answer quickly because it's the same answer.
So what we're seeing here is this creator, Aries Bratz, uses a green screen to layer her image on top of the video of Ginger Thor. And Ginger Thor is basically wearing a bonnet, which can be considered a form of a black beauty aesthetics in reference to needing to keep black hair moist and using silk or satin as a bonnet in order for them to do that. And so his use of the bonnet, he takes off the bonnet and says, oh, some people are talking that I should not be wearing this bonnet. And he takes off the bonnet only to show his long, locks of hair and saying, oh, I thought that came from somebody who cannot put their hair behind their ears. When you think about that comment, that is completely anti-black because we're looking at black women and black women's hair growth and the fact that there's different textures of hair that might not necessarily grow as steadily and as fast as women without black textured hair. And so he's using anti-black commentary in order to then position himself as one that needs or should use this particular thing more than black women themselves. And so Aries Bratz is stitching the video to describe that appropriation and to also describe her displeasure with how black women, or black people specifically, are defending what he is saying without recognizing the critical commentary that needs to take place. And it's interesting too because in 2018, I believe it was, or maybe 2019, a white woman claimed to have invented the bonnet. So this woman here, her name is Sarah Marantz, and you can see her pictured in the other, in the actual X or Twitter post, basically has claimed that she created this product in order to protect women's hair while they're sleeping. And so taking ownership of creating something. Now, if we think about the history of bonnets, we cannot necessarily describe them as black invented. However, when we think about silk and satin bonnets, that is specifically something that is considered to be a part of the black aesthetic culture just because of the fact that it holds the moisture in a way that cotton would not. So I'm thinking about the Victorian era when white women were wearing bonnets, they were wearing cotton bonnets, usually just to keep their hair in one place, whereas in the bonnets for black women have a specific function. So in this example here, what we see is a content creator, her name is Britt Barbie, and from her original video, what she's doing is using black female aesthetics to create a popularity in terms of what she's, like the video in itself is not doing anything or saying anything particularly about black women, but if you look at her aesthetics in terms of her lace front wig, some of the things that she does with her lips, the way that she's speaking, this video was critiqued for her sort of cultural manipulation of black women aesthetics in order to create attention for herself, which was actually very, very successful if you look at what has ended up happening to this particular creator. You could play that.
Period, 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 period. First thing, I be thirsting, and a bad bitch, I did doing her thing. I got them up when I walk and got them bursting, and it's funny because I wasn't even flirting, I'm just pure.
So in this video here, you see the video is duetted, and the other black woman who's doing sort of like a rap towards that duet is very, very much critiquing this video. So if you're listening to what she's saying, she's talking about you can't be us, you can mimic and manipulate these particular aesthetics, but you will never be black, and that's kind of what the words of what she's saying here. In the other video, we also see a critique of black women that is just facial. So she's just using her face to do that critique.
Period 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 period.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is another example of the labor in reference to duetting a particular video to speak to or to show some form of critique in terms of this particular representation. Now, it goes on, the list goes on. I can continue here in terms of all of these different things that we've seen and different representations that we've seen that have allowed this type of critique to take place and that have really called in black women to then do that protection, that policing of black culture and black cultural aesthetics. So this is an example of brownie glazed lips, which is what Hailey Bieber, married to Justin Bieber, says that she created in order to create a stronger lip line. So the critique here is the way in which this, again, is one of those beauty aesthetics that claims to have been created by a white woman when black women have been doing it for decades.
Nobody is better than the original. See you in jail.
Let me tell you something.
So what that creator did was stitch a few videos or a few images together to show that black women have been using that same type of beauty technique for a much longer period of time. And then the second creator adds another visual critique in reference to the same type of conversation around Hailey Bieber creating this brownie glazed lips.
Right now, you are now tuned in. Pen Griffey.
So a lot of times what we see when black women are using these different discursive tools to then critique some of these images that they're seeing online is they not using any words. They don't have to say anything. They're giving you a glance. They're giving you a look. And you are supposed to understand that that is an active critique in reference to how we use facial expressions to then express and to show how we feel about certain things. So these are just a few examples, and of course I do have more, but we won't go through those today. So what I want to talk about, or to end, to sort of like wrap this up, is the question of co-opting and appropriating culture. And so back to that original question in terms of who owns culture. So it's necessary for black women to take, is it necessary for black women to take on this policing and protecting of black cultural aesthetics? And other people might ask questions about what about the sharing of culture? What about cultural exchanges? When we think about some of the forms of culture that black women themselves take on and manipulate for their own purposes, why is that black culture or black cultural aesthetics is so important for us to then critique and to ensure that other people are not co-opting or taking over it? Now, when we think about that sort of way, there's a few things that I feel that we need to consider in this whole process of really contextualizing the importance of these analyses. So first, we have to consider the popularity. So when you have white people or non-black people taking over what seems to be rooted in black cultural survival, black cultural aesthetics, there's a population and globalization that takes, from globalization, there's an extension of the reach and influence that these images have. And if we remove and erase black women and their cultural production, their labor in creating some of what they needed to create in order to survive and exist within white societies, we are not actively showing and identifying where some of these traditions come from. There's also the question of consumerism and capitalism. So when we think about somebody like Hailey Bieber, for example, who might be creating beauty lines and who might be finding ways to insert these types of ideas within a capitalist framework, we have to then consider the profitability of what taking and co-opting black aesthetics might do, and sort of maintaining that economic power that also can be a form of digital colonialism when you think about the ways in which these messages are shared and how often they're shared. Then there's the social control. So the manipulation of cultural representations and the control of narratives that impact the daily lives of marginalized people and groups. So when we think about how changing and manipulating and co-opting, we're actually erasing and taking away these cultural representations and then changing the narratives in reference to the importance of that. There's no interrogation of power. There's no interrogation of control. A lot of these things that I've discussed here today, for example, like the bonnet, as I mentioned, it is created so that black women can keep their hair moist and neat, usually to engage within white societies. It wasn't something that we've created so that, we could just hold our hair in place. Again, with the brownie lip liner, a lot of times the lip liner was used in order to either accentuate or to de-emphasize the size of black women's lips because of how we were critiqued in reference to these physical features that are now being co-opted, and people are actually paying for lip fillers and paying for all of these different processes in order to mimic the same aesthetics that we've had to hide and to conceal within the spaces that we needed to be. So thinking about all of these things becomes the question of not ownership, but the question of how it is that we can have certain bodies that are not black use the same things that we have been criticized heavily for using, and then oftentimes losing employment, oftentimes not having the ability to be educated, having to be, I know that there are situations, I do a lot of work with black girls, and so black girls, even in Canada, for example, having to be sent home for wearing braids in their hair, when now it becomes a cool style because it's co-opted and appropriated by non-black bodies. So these are the questions that we should be asking, and these are the critiques that we should really begin to go deeper with when we're thinking about cultural appropriation, especially within digital spaces. It's not really necessarily the question of ownership and whether or not we should be sharing. It's more so the question of how it is that we can erase the culture and the significance of a group of people, and of black women specifically, in terms of their labor, when there has been so much historical context that needs to be positioned within that. So moving forward, we're focusing, or this work sort of focuses on how we begin to describe these types of resistance. So we're focusing on resistance and the many ways that black women then can continue to engage in online spaces, even when they're faced with this type of appropriation and gaslighting or race lighting within these digital spaces. Now, there are some techniques that are used by black women specifically to avoid these forms of oppression, because it creates tension to see these images used and circulated in ways that they know specifically that they would be punished for or not necessarily receive the same type of attention. So there's the training of algorithms, which is highlighted by Noble's work in 2018, which describes the process of ensuring that you don't get certain images when in your online spaces that you engage in. And then the last one, which is also one of my favorites because it sort of focuses on this concept of Afrofuturism. And what it does is it allows you to engage in a world that is post-racial, let's say. And so imagining a world where your skin color, all of the things that you do in terms of cultural production don't necessarily have to matter in the ways that it does, and imagine yourselves in different spaces that allow you to then live freely without having to deal with these types of representations. So last thing I want to say before I end is that we are the culture, and the culture is us. And we're reminded about this from certain speeches and different ways in which people have been trying to send this message, not only in online spaces, but just within the popular domain.
Black women, we are the culture, we've been the culture, and in the future, we still gonna be the culture. So shout out to us.
Thank you.
And can we put our hands together one more time for Dr. McPherson? That was such an insightful lecture and discussion. And we are going to be opening the floor now for questions and answers. And just further discussions if you want to add something to what she has said. We have a roving mic.
I'm not going to be managing the microphone, right? I am? Oh, thought you gave it to me so I could talk. First of all, just thank you very much for the presentation. Quite insightful. I'm not a social media person myself in that kind of way. So I'm not even going to ask you my own question at this time, because I do have a position on the culture of globalization and the economics of globalization and how that actually plays out in some of the manifestations that we're seeing in how we carry ourselves and what we talk about when we speak of, cultural appropriation in relation to other, other things that are happening within the space. I'm going to actually ask you a question that a viewer wants to position, because if we're going to have a conversation about how other bodies can actually take what would be really cultural, what you would identify as black aesthetics and make it something, what's your position on the reverse, where it's black people using others, the aesthetics of others as the norm, the way of life? I mean, I think of how in recent times we've seen, the rise of this quote-unquote Dolly/Barbie culture. And where, what's your position on that? I mean, a lot of us walking around with Chinese here and Indian here, and
well, mine is actually not, but
there
okay.
we go. Anyway, I just decided that I would put that one
yes,
first,
and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the question. And I think that part of the way in which I contextualize that and sort of position black bodies that are taking up other forms of culture is merely survival. I'm thinking about living in the diaspora. I live in Toronto, Canada, and I understand what it means to be a black body within diasporic spaces. And so as a result of that, this constant desire to approximate whiteness, this constant desire to take up these different cultural representations, like whatever form of hair, Brazilian or whatever it is that they're wearing, the lace fronts and all of the different ways in which black women show up, I would say that that has been rooted in wanting first to assimilate within a society, into white society, in order for them to survive. And so what we're seeing traditionally now, culturally, even though we might be moving away and there might be some opportunity for us to do something different. So you see that whole natural hair movement and people trying to sort of go back to the roots and back to the culture will take a long time for it to overturn. But I think originally when we're looking at why this took place and how we begin to critique that, we need to think about power, we need to think about control, we need to think about the marginalization of black bodies and what black bodies do in a way that has extracted any type of economic power from what they have been able to produce and to do for themselves, and why the assimilation into white society, into whiteness, becomes so important and so prominent within our society, especially when we're looking into North America. I mean, the population of black people in Canada is insignificant towards when we're comparing it to that of the population of black people in the United States. And we're seeing a lot of that cultural production in reference to wearing, lace fronts and so forth, more so in the United States. But I think that, again, when we think about the history of slavery, the amount of black bodies that have been on that land, toiling for that land, that's when we start to see the difference. Because when I talk about Canada, I sort of talk about the arrival of black people based on immigration. And it's not necessarily based in and rooted in histories of slavery. And so that those histories of slavery has forced black people within North America to then assimilate in ways that can be confusing in reference to cultural appropriation. But it goes back to who has the power, who has the profitability, and then we sort of think about it from that. I don't know how you feel about that answer, Patrick. Dr. Pendergrass. I don't know.
I mean, thank you very much for responding. I'm not going to try and hold a debate on this at this particular time. Just, I think it's an important question.
It is.
And in your response, we talk about the whole thing of survival and so on. So, I think a follow-up to that question would be, I mean, if you think of the women, especially in our space, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and the black Afro, I mean, how did they survive?
Yes.
I mean, because you're talking about a period where that sense of belonging and identity and wanting to position yourself within to present certain, certainly that which is already accepted as the aesthetics of the others, that's something that would be significant in terms of just presenting yourself in Afro. And even we know there were some big Afros then.
For sure. But then I would also...
How did they survive?
I would also say that that time was different. So we need to sort of consider the cultural shifts. When we think about the insertion of capitalism into our contemporary society and the way that capitalism and profit is everything, what we were dealing with in the 60s and the 70s when we saw those Black Power movements, they could not conceptualize, or maybe not, the world in which they were so much included into that narrative. Since then, we've had the proliferation of hip hop, we've had rap, all this black culture that has created the aesthetic of blackness as being something that is valuable and something that people ultimately want to co-op and take on for themselves. Where back in the 60s and the 70s, I think we were further removed from our inclusion into these spaces. And because I think capitalist people or people who have money in music industries and television industries recognizes the value of black representation, that it makes it as much, like, in terms of our ability to reach a particular lifestyle, to use capitalism for our own upward social mobility just seems a lot more possible. And therefore, my assimilation to these particular ideals and taking on some of the tools like social media, for example, in order to reach an economic status is more available to young people today. And so therefore, that taking on that aesthetic. So I think about it like I could talk about hip hop, for example, in the way in which that was completely changed or has been completely changed over the last the last 2 decades, the last 20 years, right? And how it started out as a music of the struggle, coming from reggae, for example, like coming from reggae, using reggae as an example in order to create this hip hop genre. And if you listen to 70s and early 80s hip hop, it was about the struggle, it was about living in, government housing, it was about, economic survival, and really teaching black youth at that particular time about what it means to be empowered as a black person. And once capitalism is inserted into those spaces and artists then get an opportunity to have access to particular amounts of money, lifestyle, and just social economic power, then they lose that interest in order to create those types of messaging. And therefore, we lose generations and generations of young people in reference to what that might look like, or what it could look like when we were thinking about a Black Power movement, for example.
My last comment, question before I pass the mic on. Okay. I know that for me, I see the social media and this digital world as really a kind of an opening up of certain kinds of technology, particularly those communication and information technologies, opening up to people who would not, under normal circumstances, have these platforms. There's a certain amount of empowerment that comes with the contemporary forms as we see them in social media. And it worries me, and I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about it. I know you never spent much time I wanted to, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about this post-racial possibility because of all that we're seeing manifesting within this digital media space. If you could just say a little bit more about that, because it seemed to me like a natural progression of the culture of globalization and the technologies that come with globalization.
So are we going to get to debate this? Because that's a very, no, not, okay. We won't get to debate this, but I understand this point. And I mean, having conversations with you, I know that that would be a position that would be taken. However, I would say that it's a farce. I don't believe that there is black empowerment. There's black empowerment for certain very small groups of people at the expense of everybody else. And so I don't necessarily think that we're using the digital spaces as much as we could because we are too concerned with and too interested in the capitalist way of doing that. It's not going to bring black people any kind of power or freedom. The way, it's sort of like what Audre Lorde would call it as the master's tools. So Audre Lorde says, you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. If it's freedom we're looking for, we cannot use white supremacist tools in order for black people to be free. And so I would say that I think part of, and it's a cultural studies thing, it's the way in which we've been sort of pacified to believe that we are a part of this society, a part of this system that allows us to then engage in wealth and sort of build wealth and economic freedom. So you see the Jay-Z's and the Beyoncé's and all of these wealthy, or not all of these, but a few wealthy black people. And then we begin to think that this is a possibility for all of us. But I will say that I don't believe our system is, or the systems were created to support black wealth in an extended way, where places like Jamaica, for example, will see free education, we'll see free healthcare, we'll see the humanity of the people who live here seen as actual people. I don't believe that it's set up that way. I believe that we're just continually forced into a way of thinking that it is, so that we are pacified to continue to participate within the capitalist society. But we could debate this at another time.
Any other question?
Any other questions? Comments? I'm going to read a comment from YouTube. Doreen Prendergrass says that this was a scholarly representation of what is happening to and around black aesthetics in the social media space. So she was just commending your presentation. Any other comments, questions, discussion points, commendations? Want to say something, Miss Indira? Sir, the mic. Dr. Prendergrass, the mic.
No, just saying that was an excellent lecture. I normally see the discourse, for lack of a better word, on social media, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, of black persons or black females critiquing, but I've never framed it or thought about it in such a way as I've seen you present it, and I thought that was excellent. I just say, oh God, there's just so much that we can do just by thinking about it, and I see the resistance. Well, from your presentation, I did not see that before, so it's quite eye-opening for me, and I'm happy I attended.
Thank you, thank you. I think it's really important to emphasize the labor that black women are putting in these digital spaces for cultural protection and preservation, just by virtue of using their face, for example, their facial expressions, or coming in to comment on things that have been co-opted and claimed as from ownership from other groups of people. And I feel like it's important for us to recognize that contribution because it is scholarly, and it is important for us to realize that we're so used to seeing black women's labor within the context of our communities and in our schools and in our governments and so forth. This labor continues in other spaces as well because the oppression continues in other spaces. So that's it. Thank you.
All right, and just to highlight or just to announce that Dr. Prendergrass would have asked Mrs. Faye Ellington's questions, or Miss Faye Ellington's questions earlier, so that was already asked. And a final comment from social media comes from Andre, who also highlighted that it was a great lecture. So at this time, I'm going to be... Do you have a question or comment? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I know that I came and caught like the last 5 minutes, but I was intrigued by your presentation. I just want to ask if there is any way that discussions regarding this could be perhaps incorporated in the curriculum. I know that it's done at UWI, but I'm thinking even at the community college level, because I teach Caribbean studies there, so that's why I came. And we do, you know, Pan-Africanism and all of that, but we never really focused on, you know, black women as a separate topic. So I was wondering if, you know, going forward, if there would be any opportunities to incorporate something like this in the curriculum at lower levels, because we don't just want to only hear about this at UWI, but we need younger women to learn about this going forward. So I don't know if you could shed any light on.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I even in my work at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, this is not exactly what I teach. I teach other aspects of it. So what we're calling for is more opportunities to build curriculum and to sort of create that. What I would say for you, for example, if there's opportunities at the community college level for you to even insert this into a class on Caribbean studies, for example, before, and then sort of test to see how popular, how receptive the students are on that, and sort of bringing that to the administration to ensure that they have and create courses that allow them to further interrogate this type of information. But as an educator myself, I'm always looking for ways to do that. And so if you do get an opportunity, I would say to email me, and then we could talk about what some of those curricular materials can look like, and how we can begin to engage at various levels around these topics so that we're building knowledge and understanding within the people who are directly impacted by these types of representations and what they might do for their experience in the spaces in the world. Yeah, thank you for that.
All right, thank you very much for the questions. And just the final comments from three final comments from social media. So Faye Ellington just wanted to add to her point. She said that we not only survived the 60s and 70s, but we were trailblazers. And she says that we were not further removed at all. Capitalism is not new. We fought it. And there was free education in the 70s to the university level. And final comment from Doreen Prendergrass, she says, is there a need for shifting of mindset as to how we treat with black inventions to that which melds the cultural value with the economics? And that's the final question.
Okay, great, thank you. And to both those comments there, yes, for sure. In the 60s and 70s, I was not suggesting that capitalism is new. I was saying the way in which it is embedded into contemporary society today has been more forceful, it's more integrated, it's embedded. So for example, within TikTok, Instagram, any of these social media platforms, there's marketplaces, there's advertisements, and in the 60s and 70s, we did not yet have this form of technology that was global in reference to its reach and in reference to how people would access this type of information. And so just in itself, the technology of the internet has created new dimensions for which becomes difficult for us to sort of maintain and to preserve culture in a way that I think would be a benefit for black people across the globe. And so I think that that's really where the difference is. That's where the cultural shift is in terms of the internet, in terms of globalization, and how far and wide-reaching some of this information and access. And also what is used to sort of pull us into and to expect and to desire specific types of lifestyles has also changed. And in reference to shifting the mindset, in terms of Doreen Prendergrass's question, I definitely think that we need to sort of go back to some of the basics, maybe back to some of what was taking place in the 60s and the 70s, so that we can focus on our culture, focus on who we are as a people, and see how we can use the current state of our society, how capitalism, how the media and digital spaces can be used in order for us to economically empower ourselves in ways that speaks to the needs of our community and not an individualistic sort of mode of thinking. So coming out of this diasporic way of being, which is very individual, and coming back to a community, collective way so that we can support the development of our people, of our communities together, and use some of these tools in order for us to then to see that happen, for that to actually manifest into something that can actually be useful for the development of Black people across the globe.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. Can we put our hands together one more time for Dr. McPherson? A really insightful discussion tonight. I'm going to be calling upon Miss Carla Edwards at this time, who will be doing a presentation to Doc.
Dr. McPherson, on behalf of the UEMONA, Western Jamaica campus, I present to you this token of our appreciation for your very thoughtful, thought-provoking, and excellent presentation, and wish you a safe journey home, and hope that you'll come back and visit us and really
For
give
sure.
us some more.
Yes, thank you so very much. And again, I want to thank you for the invitation and for the ability to share some of these ideas within this space. And I appreciate everyone who's taken the time to come and to listen. And so thank you again, and thank you to Dr. Prendergast as well for the invitation, and for the campus for hosting and having me. Thank you.
All right, so this was indeed an enlightening journey and exploration for us to really understand what is happening with Black girls and women in the digital era. And I think that we all are leaving here a little more enlightened, a little more aware of what is happening. As Dr. Prendergast would have highlighted, he isn't really on social media, but I think after tonight's discussion, he's a little bit more aware of what's happening in the digital space. So I just want to thank everybody for coming by tonight, for stopping, for engaging with us on our Black My Story Monday lecture series. It has been a good evening, and I'm encouraging us to come out again next week, not next week, this is the final one. So we are ending it on a high, all right? So I want us to all have a good evening, and let us not just leave the discussion here, but let us carry it on in our different spaces as we, go forward, and as we engage in this digital space, we become more aware of what is happening. So a good evening to everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Brittany Forsyth.